How was New York in 1865? A comprehensive historical overview. Chapter 1: The Physical City. America's Great Metropolis. A city at war's end. In the year 1865, New York City stood as the largest, wealthiest, and most dynamic city in the United States. With a population approaching 850,000 souls packed onto the island of Manhattan and spilling into Brooklyn and the surrounding areas, New York had established itself as the commercial, financial, and cultural capital of a nation that had just survived the bloodiest war in its history. The Civil War had ended in April of this fateful year. General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th, and a nation exhausted by 4 years of carnage had begun to celebrate. But just 5 days later, on April 14th, President Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington. He died the following morning. The joy of victory transformed instantly into grief and rage. New York, which had been divided over the war and had witnessed the terrible draft riots just 2 years earlier, now mourned alongside the nation. This was the New York of 1865, a city of contradictions, a place of enormous wealth and desperate poverty, of patriotic fervor and lingering resentment, of unprecedented growth and persistent problems. It was a city that had profited enormously from the war, while sending thousands of its young men to die in it. It was a city looking forward to a future that seemed limitless, even as it grappled with the wounds of a conflict that had torn the nation apart. The physical city in 1865 was concentrated primarily on the lower half of Manhattan Island. Development extended roughly to 42nd Street, though settlement became increasingly sparse above 23rd Street. Below 14th Street, the city was densely packed, its streets crowded with humanity and commerce. Above that line, farms, estates, and vacant lots alternated with new residential developments pushing northward. The streets and grid. The famous Manhattan street grid, established by the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, had imposed order on the island's development. North of Houston Street, the numbered streets and avenues created a rational pattern that facilitated expansion and made navigation simple. But below Houston Street, the old colonial street patterns remained, the winding lanes and irregular blocks that dated to Dutch and English settlement. Broadway was the city's spine, running from the Battery at the southern tip northward through the heart of the island. This great thoroughfare was the most fashionable address, lined with hotels, theaters, shops, and offices. The Broadway of 1865 was a chaos of traffic, horse-drawn omnibuses, private carriages, delivery wagons, and countless pedestrians competing for space on its cobblestone surface. The streets were paved with cobblestones or granite blocks on the main thoroughfares, but many side streets remained unpaved, turning to mud in wet weather and choking with dust when dry. Street cleaning was inconsistent, and horse manure accumulated everywhere. An estimated 100,000 horses worked in Manhattan, each producing over 20 pounds of manure daily. The smell and the flies were constant companions of city life. Traffic was a growing problem that seemed to have no solution. The streets had been designed for a smaller population with slower vehicles. Now they were overwhelmed. Crossing Broadway could take 10 minutes of waiting for a gap in the endless stream of vehicles. Traffic jams lasting hours were not uncommon. People talked of building railways above or below the streets, but such plans remained largely theoretical. The harbor and waterfront. New York's harbor was arguably its greatest asset, the foundation of its commercial supremacy. The natural harbor formed by the confluence of the Hudson and East Rivers, protected by the Narrows and accessible to ocean-going vessels, had made New York a port without peer in America. The waterfront in 1865 stretched for miles along both the Hudson and East River shores. Wooden piers extended into the water, accommodating ships from around the world. Warehouses lined the shore, storing goods awaiting shipment or recently arrived. The noise, smell, and chaos of the waterfront created a world unto itself. The East River waterfront was particularly busy, handling much of the coastal trade and the ferry traffic connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn and other communities across the river. The Brooklyn Ferry, immortalized by Walt Whitman, carried millions of passengers annually across the busy waterway. Plans for a bridge connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn were being discussed, but the engineering challenges seemed immense. The Hudson River waterfront handled much of the transatlantic trade. Great steamships now competed with sailing vessels, though sail remained important. The piers were crowded with immigrants arriving from Europe, with goods from Britain, France, Germany, and beyond. The Hudson also connected New York to the interior via the Erie Canal, making the city the gateway to the American heartland. Architecture and landmarks. The architectural character of 1865 New York was primarily brick and brownstone, with cast iron beginning to appear in commercial buildings. The city's appearance was lower than it would later become. Most buildings were 4 to 6 stories, though a few reached higher. The technology that would enable true skyscrapers remained decades in the future. City Hall, completed in 1812, remained the seat of city government. Its elegant federal architecture presided over City Hall Park, though the building was already proving inadequate for the growing municipal administration. The infamous Tweed Ring was consolidating power, and Boss Tweed himself was rising to the height of his corrupt influence. Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street was one of the city's most prominent landmarks. Its Gothic Revival spire rose 281 feet, making it the tallest structure in New York. The church had been completed in 1846, replacing earlier structures on the same site. The brownstone row house was becoming the characteristic residential architecture for the prosperous. These 4-story houses, with their high stoops and ornate facades, lined the streets of fashionable neighborhoods. Lower down the social scale, older houses were subdivided into apartments, and purpose-built tenements housed the poor. Central Park was under construction, having begun in 1857. By 1865, much of the park was complete and open to the public, providing green space that would become increasingly precious as the city grew. Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux's design created an illusion of natural landscape in the heart of the grid. Chapter 2: The People. A city of immigrants and natives. A diverse population. New York in 1865 was home to approximately 850,000 people, making it by far the largest city in the United States. Philadelphia was a distant second, with about 600,000 residents. This population was remarkably diverse, comprising native-born Americans and immigrants from across Europe who had come seeking opportunity, freedom, or simply survival. The population was young, with high birth rates and substantial immigration constantly adding to the numbers. The streets were filled with children, working, playing, begging, or simply existing in the crowded neighborhoods. Large families were the norm. A woman might bear 6, 8, or more children, though many would not survive to adulthood. The war had taken its toll on the male population. Thousands of New York men had served in the Union Army, and thousands had died at Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, and countless other battles and skirmishes. The returning soldiers of 1865 brought their own challenges, physical wounds, psychological trauma, and disrupted lives that needed to be rebuilt. Women had filled many roles during the war years, working in factories, offices, and positions previously reserved for men. What would happen now that the men returned remained uncertain. Some women would return to traditional roles. Others had discovered possibilities they were reluctant to abandon. Irish immigrants. The Irish formed the largest immigrant group in 1865 New York, comprising perhaps a quarter of the city's population. They had arrived in massive numbers during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s, fleeing starvation and oppression in their homeland. By 1865, Irish neighborhoods dominated much of Lower Manhattan, particularly the infamous Five Points district. The Irish occupied the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. They worked as laborers, domestic servants, dock workers, and in other physically demanding jobs. They faced prejudice from native-born Americans, who viewed them with suspicion and contempt. No Irish need apply signs were common. The Catholic religion of most Irish immigrants added another dimension to the prejudice they faced in a predominantly Protestant society. The draft riots of July 1863 had revealed the depths of Irish anger and frustration. Outraged by a conscription law that allowed wealthy men to buy their way out of service, Irish workers had risen in a violent uprising that lasted 4 days, killed over 100 people, and targeted African Americans with particular fury. The memory of those riots remained fresh in 1865, shaping how Irish immigrants were viewed and how they viewed themselves. Yet the Irish were also building power. Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine, was increasingly Irish in character. The political organization provided services to immigrants, help finding jobs, assistance with legal problems, intervention with authorities, in exchange for votes. This system, corrupt as it was, represented one path to power for a despised minority. German immigrants. Germans formed the second largest immigrant group, numbering perhaps 200,000 in the city. Unlike the Irish, Germans came from varied backgrounds: Catholics and Protestants, skilled craftsmen and professionals, political refugees, and economic migrants. Their diversity made them less visible as a unified group, but allowed for more varied paths to advancement. German neighborhoods, particularly Kleindeutschland, Little Germany, on the Lower East Side, maintained their distinctive character. German-language newspapers, churches, schools, and social organizations created a community within the city. Beer gardens and musical societies provided cultural continuity with the homeland. Many Germans had arrived with skills that allowed them to establish themselves as craftsmen, shopkeepers, or professionals. German brewers were transforming the American beer industry. German furniture makers, printers, and mechanics found ready markets for their skills. The German community was generally more prosperous than the Irish, though poverty existed among Germans as well. German Jews formed a distinct subgroup, having arrived primarily from Bavaria and other German states. They were establishing themselves in business, particularly in the garment trade and retail. The great Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe was still in the future, but the foundations were being laid. Native-born Americans. Native-born Americans of English, Dutch, and other colonial ancestry still held most positions of power and prestige in 1865 New York. The old Knickerbocker families, descendants of the original Dutch settlers, maintained their social prominence even as their numerical significance declined. The Protestant establishment controlled the major banks, insurance companies, and trading houses. They lived in the finest houses, attended the most fashionable churches, and set the standards of respectable society. Their children attended private academies and, increasingly, colleges like Columbia, Yale, and Harvard. But the native-born population was itself diverse. Migrants from other American states, particularly New England, had come to New York seeking opportunity. The city drew ambitious young people from across the nation, offering possibilities that smaller communities could not match. African Americans. The African American population of New York in 1865 numbered approximately 10,000 to 12,000, a small but significant community. Slavery had been abolished in New York State in 1827, and the city had long had a free black population. But freedom did not mean equality, and African Americans faced discrimination in nearly every aspect of life. The draft riots of 1863 had targeted African Americans with murderous fury. Rioters had burned the Colored Orphan Asylum, lynched black men, and driven thousands from their homes. Many had fled the city entirely and had not returned. Those who remained lived with the memory of that violence and the knowledge that it could recur. Employment options were severely limited. African Americans were largely excluded from skilled trades and manufacturing. They worked as domestic servants, laborers, and in service occupations. A small middle class of ministers, teachers, and small business people provided community leadership, but economic advancement was difficult. The end of slavery in the South through the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment created new possibilities. Some New York African Americans looked south, hoping to help the freedmen or to find opportunities in a transformed region. Others remained, determined to build their lives in the city despite its hostility. Chapter 3: Daily Life Survival in the Growing City. The Working Day. Life in 1865, New York followed rhythms dictated by work, class, and the demands of an increasingly industrial economy. The working day was long by modern standards, 10, 12, or even 14 hours for many workers. The concept of the 8-hour day was a reform goal, not a reality. Factory whistles and church bells called workers to their employment. The city came alive early, with workers heading to their jobs in the darkness of winter mornings. Street vendors began their rounds. Shops opened their doors. The great machinery of commerce began another day's work. The nature of work was changing. Factories were replacing traditional craft work for many products. The sewing machine, increasingly common, was transforming the garment industry. Workers who had once crafted entire garments now performed single operations repeatedly. This specialization increased productivity but diminished skill and autonomy. Women worked in factories, particularly in textiles and garment production. They also worked as domestic servants, with perhaps 50,000 women employed in service in Manhattan alone. Seamstresses, laundresses, and vendors added to the female workforce. Women earned far less than men for comparable work, a disparity accepted as natural. Children worked alongside adults in many industries. Newsboys, bootblacks, messengers, and street vendors were visible on every corner. In factories and workshops, children performed tasks suited to their small fingers. Reformers were beginning to question child labor, but the practice remained widespread and largely unregulated. Food and meals. Food in 1865. New York was abundant for those who could afford it and scarce for those who could not. The city's markets, Washington Market for meat and produce, Fulton Fish Market for seafood, provided an enormous variety of foods to a population with varied tastes and budgets. The wealthy ate magnificently. Multi-course meals featuring fresh meats, vegetables, imported delicacies, and elaborate desserts were served by uniformed servants on fine china. Restaurants like Delmonico's catered to the elite, with French cuisine that rivaled anything in Paris. Wine, champagne, and fine spirits accompanied meals. The middle classes ate well, but more simply. The traditional American diet of meat, bread, potatoes, and vegetables provided substance, if not elegance. Iceboxes, becoming more common, allowed for better preservation of perishables. Home cooking remained the norm, with servants handling food preparation in more prosperous households. The poor ate what they could afford. Bread, potatoes, and cheap cuts of meat provided sustenance. Street vendors sold hot corn, oysters, and other inexpensive foods. Many families could not afford proper cooking facilities and ate meals purchased from cook shops or street sellers. Malnutrition was common, weakening resistance to the diseases that haunted the slums. Oysters were remarkably cheap and abundant, harvested from beds in the harbor that would later be destroyed by pollution. Oyster saloons catered to all classes, offering this affordable protein to anyone with a few pennies. Oyster sellers pushed carts through the streets, offering their wares. Housing conditions. Housing in 1865 New York ranged from the mansions of Fifth Avenue to the cellars where the poorest lived in conditions unfit for animals. The quality of one's housing reflected and reinforced one's place in the social hierarchy. The wealthy built increasingly elaborate homes as they moved northward on Manhattan. Fifth Avenue was becoming the most fashionable address, lined with mansions that displayed their owners' wealth. These houses featured the latest amenities: gas lighting, running water, indoor plumbing, and central heating. Middle-class brownstones provided comfortable housing for professionals and successful merchants. These four-story houses offered parlors for entertaining, dining rooms for family meals, bedrooms for family members, and servant quarters in basement and attic. Such a house might shelter a family of 6 plus 2 or 3 servants. Working-class housing was increasingly inadequate. Tenements, buildings designed specifically to house multiple families in minimal space, were multiplying. A typical tenement might house 20 or more families, with shared privies in the yard and water from a common pump. Rooms were small, dark, and poorly ventilated. The worst housing defied description. Rear tenements, built in the yards behind street-front buildings, received almost no light or air. Cellars housed families in damp, dark spaces below street level. Rooms designed for one person housed entire families. The overcrowding bred disease and misery on an appalling scale. Health and sanitation. Disease was a constant threat in 1865 New York, particularly for the poor. The connection between sanitation and health was increasingly understood, but practical improvements lagged far behind knowledge. The water supply was problematic. The Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, brought relatively clean water from Westchester County, but distribution within the city was uneven, and many poor neighborhoods lacked access. Wells in densely populated areas were contaminated by nearby privies. Sewage disposal was primitive. Most buildings relied on privies and cesspits that were periodically emptied by night soil men. The waste often ended up in the rivers or in vacant lots. Only the newer, wealthier areas had connections to the partial sewer system. Epidemic diseases struck regularly. Cholera had devastated the city in 1832 and 1849 and remained a threat Typhus spread through the crowded tenements. Tuberculosis, called consumption, claimed thousands annually. Childhood diseases, measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, killed many before they reached adulthood. Medical care was improving, but remained limited. Hospitals served primarily the poor, the wealthy were treated at home. The germ theory of disease was not yet fully accepted, and many treatments were ineffective or harmful. Surgery, though transformed by anesthesia, remained dangerous because antiseptic techniques were not yet understood. Transportation. Getting around 1865 New York required patience, money, or strong legs. The city had outgrown its transportation system, and every option had significant drawbacks. Walking was the most common mode of transportation, particularly for the working classes. People walked miles daily to and from work, to shop, and to conduct their business. The streets were crowded with pedestrians at all hours. Horse-drawn omnibuses provided public transportation along major routes. These large vehicles, carrying perhaps 20 passengers, moved slowly through congested streets. The fares, typically 6 cents, were beyond the reach of the poorest workers, but accessible to the working and middle classes. Horse-drawn streetcars, running on rails set into the street's surface, were somewhat faster and more comfortable than omnibuses. Several lines operated along major thoroughfares. The rails allowed heavier loads and smoother rides, but the cars still moved at the pace of their horses. Private carriages served the wealthy. Maintaining a carriage, horses, and coachman was expensive, marking its owner as prosperous. For occasional needs, livery stables rented vehicles, and hack coaches were available for hire. Ferries connected Manhattan to Brooklyn, New Jersey, and other surrounding communities. The Brooklyn Ferry was particularly busy, carrying commuters, merchants, and travelers across the East River. These vessels departed frequently, but were subject to weather and river conditions. Chapter 4. The Civil War's End. Victory, Tragedy, and Aftermath. The war's impact on New York. The Civil War had transformed New York City in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. The city had been the financial and commercial engine of the Union war effort, providing money, supplies, and men, but it had also been deeply divided, with significant sympathy for the Confederacy among Democrats and those tied to the cotton trade. New York had contributed over 150,000 men to the Union Army and Navy. Regiments like the 69th New York, the Irish Brigade, had earned legendary reputations on battlefields from Bull Run to Appomattox. The city's arsenals had produced weapons and ammunition, its shipyards had built warships, its banks had financed the war through the purchase of government bonds. But the city had also resisted the war at times. The Democratic Party, powerful in New York, had opposed many of Lincoln's policies. The business community, dependent on Southern cotton, had initially urged compromise. When compromise failed and war came, many accepted it reluctantly. The draft riots of July 1863 had been the most violent expression of opposition, when the federal government instituted conscription, and when working men learned that the wealthy could buy exemptions for $300, rage exploded. For 4 days, mobs ruled the streets, burning, looting, and killing. The violence targeted African Americans especially, seen as the cause of a war that was killing white workers. Over 100 people died before troops fresh from Gettysburg restored order. Victory celebrations. When news of Lee's surrender reached New York on April 10, 1865, the city erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, cannons fired salutes, crowds filled the streets, cheering, singing, and embracing strangers. The war that had seemed endless was finally over. The Union was preserved. For 4 days, the celebrations continued. Businesses closed, flags flew from every building, grand illuminations lit the nights, speakers extolled the triumph of liberty over rebellion. The terrible sacrifices seemed, at last, to have meaning. Then came the devastating news from Washington. President Lincoln had been shot on the evening of April 14th while attending a play at Ford's Theater. He died the following morning, April 15th, 1865. The assassin was John Wilkes Booth, an actor with Confederate sympathies. The shock was profound. The man who had led the nation through its darkest hours, who had preserved the Union and freed the slaves, was dead. The celebrations stopped instantly. The city draped itself in black. Buildings that had been illuminated in joy now displayed mourning crepe. Lincoln's funeral. Lincoln's body was brought to New York as part of a long funeral journey from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. On April 24th and 25th, the president's remains lay in state at City Hall, and hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers filed past to pay their respects. The funeral procession through the city was an extraordinary spectacle. The hearse, drawn by 16 gray horses, moved slowly up Broadway. Soldiers marched, bands played funeral dirges, tens of thousands of civilians followed the cortege. Windows along the route were filled with mourners. Photographs taken of the procession captured the solemnity of the occasion, the crowds lining Broadway, the buildings draped in black, the slow-moving hearse. These images became icons of national grief. A young Theodore Roosevelt, not yet 7 years old, watched from a window in his grandfather's house. The mourning for Lincoln revealed something complex about New York's relationship with the slain president. Many who now wept had opposed him during his lifetime. The Democratic press that now praised him had vilified him just months before, but death transformed the president into a martyr, and even his former enemies felt compelled to honor him. Returning soldiers. Throughout 1865, soldiers returned home from the war. Some came individually, their enlistments completed or their wounds healing. Others came in units, marching through the city in grand reviews that celebrated their service. The famous Grand Review in Washington in May was mirrored by smaller celebrations across the North. The returning soldiers faced a city that had changed during their absence, and challenges for which their military experience had not prepared them. Jobs they had left might no longer exist. Families they had left might have changed. The skills they had learned in war were not easily converted to peacetime employment. Many soldiers were wounded, missing limbs, suffering from lingering illnesses contracted in camps and hospitals, or bearing psychological scars that would not heal. The concept of post-traumatic stress was not understood, but its reality was visible in men who could not sleep, who drank to forget, who erupted in unexpected violence. Veterans organizations were forming to provide mutual support and to advocate for benefits. The Grand Army of the Republic, founded in 1866, would become a powerful political force, uniting Union veterans and securing pensions and other assistance. The Draft Riots' legacy. The draft riots of 1863 cast a long shadow over 1865 New York. The violence had traumatized the city, revealing hatreds and tensions that many had preferred not to acknowledge. The memory shaped how different groups viewed each other and how they understood their place in the city. African Americans lived with the knowledge that their neighbors had tried to kill them. The burned-colored orphan asylum was being rebuilt, but the fear remained. Many who had fled during the riots did not return. Those who stayed knew that another outbreak of violence was always possible. Irish immigrants faced heightened suspicion and hostility. They were blamed for the riots, though in truth the rioters came from various backgrounds. The association with mob violence reinforced prejudices that the Irish were uncivilized and dangerous. Political leaders worked to rebuild their community's reputation. The city's establishment drew lessons about the need for order. A larger, better organized police force would prevent future riots. The National Guard would remain available to suppress disorder. The dangerous classes must be controlled through a combination of force and charity. Chapter 5: Commerce and Economy. The engine of American capitalism. Wall Street and finance. Wall Street in 1865 was the undisputed financial capital of the United States, a position it had consolidated during the war years. The government's enormous borrowing to finance the conflict had created new financial instruments and new fortunes. Banks, brokerages, and investment houses concentrated on a few blocks of Lower Manhattan, controlling the flow of capital that powered the nation's economy. The New York Stock Exchange, founded in 1792 under a buttonwood tree, had grown into a major institution, trading in government bonds, railroad stocks, and other securities created and destroyed fortunes daily. Speculation was rampant, and the line between legitimate investment and gambling was often unclear. Jay Cooke, who had organized the sale of war bonds to the public, was a financial hero. His innovative techniques, advertising, patriotic appeals, small denominations, had allowed ordinary citizens to invest in the Union cause while financing the war. These techniques would be applied to peacetime enterprises, expanding capital markets beyond traditional elites. Banking was consolidating. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 had created a system of federally chartered banks that issued uniform currency. The chaotic system of state bank notes, each with its own design and uncertain value, was giving way to standardized national currency. This standardization facilitated commerce and reduced fraud. Shipping and trade. New York's port handled the majority of American foreign trade, a dominance that had only increased during the war. While Confederate raiders had driven many American ships from the seas, New York merchants had adapted, using foreign vessels to carry their goods. Now, with peace, the maritime trade was poised for further expansion. The steamship was transforming ocean commerce. Scheduled sailings made trade more predictable. Faster crossings reduced the time that capital was tied up in transit. The great steamship lines, Cunard, Inman, Collins, competed for passengers and freight. Immigration continued to pour through the port. Castle Garden at the Battery served as the immigrant processing center, predecessor to Ellis Island. Hundreds of thousands of Europeans arrived annually, seeking new lives in America. They brought labor, skills, and ambitions that would fuel economic growth. The Erie Canal remained crucial to New York's economy, connecting the port to the Great Lakes and the agricultural heartland. Grain, lumber, and other products flowed eastward. Manufactured goods flowed west. The canal's success had made New York the gateway to the interior, securing its commercial supremacy. Manufacturing and industry. Manufacturing in New York was diverse and growing. The war had stimulated industrial production, and peacetime promised continued expansion. The city produced everything from heavy machinery to fine clothing, from printed matter to processed foods. The garment industry was particularly important. Ready-made clothing, once considered inferior to custom tailoring, was becoming acceptable for all but the wealthy. The sewing machine had revolutionized production, allowing faster, cheaper manufacture. Much of this work was done in workshops and homes, under conditions that reformers were beginning to document and decry. Publishing and printing employed thousands. New York was the center of American publishing, home to major newspapers, book publishers, and magazine producers. The war had expanded the appetite for news, and multiple newspapers competed for readers. Harper's Weekly, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and others combined news with illustrations. Sugar refining, shipbuilding, ironworks, breweries, and countless other industries contributed to the manufacturing sector. The industrial belts along the waterfront processed raw materials from around the world and produced goods for domestic and foreign markets. The emerging Gilded Age. The economic trends of 1865 pointed toward the Gilded Age that would flower in the following decades. Great fortunes were being made, and those who made them were beginning to display their wealth with unprecedented ostentation. Cornelius Vanderbilt was consolidating his railroad empire. William Backhouse Astor was collecting rents from vast real estate holdings. Alexander Turney Stewart operated the largest retail store in the world. These men and others like them were becoming an American aristocracy of wealth. The gap between rich and poor was widening. The war had created new millionaires while workers struggled with rising prices and stagnant wages. Labor unrest was increasing as workers began to organize for better conditions and higher pay. The tensions that would mark the Gilded Age were already visible. Corruption accompanied the accumulation of wealth. Tammany Hall was reaching the height of its power under Boss Tweed, who would steal tens of millions from the city. The marriage of political power and private wealth created opportunities for graft on an unprecedented scale. The Transportation Revolution. Railroads were transforming the American economy, and New York was at the center of this revolution. The city was the terminus of multiple rail lines and the financial headquarters of railroads stretching across the continent. The wealth being created and stolen through railroad development was reshaping American capitalism. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Old Commodore, was consolidating his control over the New York Central and other railroads. His methods were aggressive, his ethics questionable, but his business acumen was undeniable. The railroad empire he was building would be the greatest fortune in America. The Transcontinental Railroad was under construction, its completion in 1869, already anticipated. This great project would bind the nation together, opening Western resources to Eastern markets, and completing the conquest of the continent. Within the city, transportation improvements were urgently needed. Elevated railroads were being proposed to move traffic above the congested streets. Underground railways were discussed, though the technical challenges seemed formidable. The city that would not walk must find ways to move its growing population. Chapter 6: Culture, Religion, and Society. Churches and Religion. Religion remained central to American life in 1865, and New York's churches reflected the diversity of its population. Protestant denominations, Episcopal, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, and others, served the native-born and long-established populations. Catholic churches served the Irish and many Germans. Jewish synagogues served the growing Jewish community. The great Protestant churches of Lower Manhattan served the wealthy and respectable. Trinity Church on Wall Street was the most prominent, its spire dominating the financial district. Grace Church on Broadway was fashionable. These churches represented established power, their congregations drawn from the city's elite. Catholic churches served the immigrant poor. St. Patrick's Cathedral on Mott Street was the seat of the Archbishop, but a new, grander St. Patrick's was under construction on Fifth Avenue. This new cathedral, still decades from completion, would proclaim Catholic prominence in American life. Religious differences contributed to social divisions. Protestant suspicion of Catholics, rooted in centuries of European conflict, remained potent. Catholics resented Protestant dominance and discrimination. Jews faced prejudice from both groups. Religion bound communities together while separating them from others. Education and literacy. Education in 1865. New York was expanding but remained uneven. The public school system, established in earlier decades, provided free elementary education to many children, but attendance was not compulsory, and many children worked rather than attended school. The public schools were increasingly professional, with trained teachers and organized curricula. They served a democratizing function, bringing together children from different backgrounds and teaching them common values and knowledge. They also served an Americanizing function, teaching English and American culture to immigrant children. Private schools served those who could afford them or who rejected public education for religious or social reasons. Catholic parochial schools provided education with religious instruction that public schools could not offer. Elite private academies prepared the children of the wealthy for college and for their expected positions in society. Higher education was available for the select few. Columbia College educated young men from prominent families. The College of the City of New York, founded as the Free Academy, offered opportunities for able students without family wealth. Professional schools trained doctors, lawyers, and clergy. Literacy was widespread, but not universal. Newspapers and magazines reached a mass audience. Popular literature, including the dime novels just emerging, entertained the literate masses. Books remained relatively expensive, but lending libraries provided access for those who could not afford to purchase. The press and public opinion. Newspapers were the primary medium for news and opinion, and New York was the center of American journalism. Multiple daily papers competed for readers, representing different political views and appealing to different audiences. The New York Herald, founded by James Gordon Bennett, pioneered sensational journalism and claimed the largest circulation. The New York Tribune, edited by Horace Greeley, championed reform causes and Republican politics. The New York Times, founded in 1851, aimed for respectability and accuracy. The Democratic press, including the New York World, represented different views. The newspapers reflected and shaped public opinion on the great issues of the day. How should the defeated South be reconstructed? What should be the status of the freed slaves? How should the economic disruption of the war be managed? These questions filled the editorial pages. Magazines complemented the newspapers. Harper's Weekly provided illustrated news coverage. The Atlantic Monthly offered serious literature and commentary. Specialty publications served every interest, from religion to fashion to sports. Entertainment and leisure. New Yorkers found entertainment in countless forms, from the refined pleasures of the Academy of Music to the rough amusements of the concert saloon. Class determined which entertainments were acceptable, but all classes sought relief from the demands of daily life. The theater flourished. Broadway was becoming synonymous with theatrical entertainment, though theaters were scattered throughout the city. Serious drama, comedy, and musical entertainment drew audiences. Stars like Edwin Booth, brother of the assassin, commanded devoted followings. P.T. Barnum's American Museum, until its destruction by fire in July 1865, had offered a mixture of curiosities, freaks, and entertainment that drew huge crowds. Barnum was rebuilding, demonstrating the resilience of the entertainment industry. Concert saloons offered entertainment of a different sort: music, drink, and the company of women in an atmosphere that respectable citizens condemned. These establishments catered to working-class men seeking relief from crowded lodgings and demanding labor. Sports were developing, but not yet organized into modern forms. Baseball was becoming the national pastime, with amateur clubs competing and professional leagues emerging. Boxing attracted followers despite its dubious legality. Horse racing drew crowds to tracks outside the city. Social reform and moral uplift. Reform movements sought to address the social problems that industrialization and immigration had created or intensified. Religious conviction, humanitarian concern, and fear of social disorder all motivated these efforts. Organizations addressed specific problems. The Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace, worked to rescue street children through education and placement with farm families in the West. The YMCA provided wholesome environments for young men away from home. Temperance organizations fought the evils of drink. Women were particularly active in reform movements, though they faced resistance from men who considered public activity inappropriate for females. Women organized charitable societies, visited the poor, and advocated for change. The experience gained in these activities would fuel the women's rights movement in coming years. The social gospel, an understanding of Christianity that emphasized social reform as religious duty, was taking shape. Ministers preached that Christians must work to improve earthly conditions, as well as save souls. This theology would influence reform movements for decades. Conclusion. New York in 1865 was a city transformed by war and poised for transformations still to come. The Union's victory had preserved the nation and ended slavery, but the peace brought its own challenges. How to rebuild, how to integrate 4 million freed slaves, how to heal the wounds of a conflict that had killed over 600,000 Americans. These questions had no easy answers. The city itself embodied the contradictions of the American experiment. It was a place of enormous wealth and desperate poverty, of democratic ideals and vicious prejudice, of soaring ambition and grinding toil. The same streets that witnessed triumphant parades for returning veterans saw children begging for food. The same newspapers that celebrated peace reported crimes born of desperation. Yet, there was reason for hope. The city was growing, its economy expanding, its possibilities seemingly limitless. The war had demonstrated what American industry and determination could accomplish. The technologies being developed, railroads, telegraphs, steam power, manufacturing innovations, promised a future of abundance and progress. The New York of 1865 was creating the America of the Gilded Age and beyond. The financial institutions consolidating on Wall Street would power economic expansion. The immigrants crowding the tenements would build the cities and factories. The political machines organizing in Tammany Hall would shape urban governance for generations. For those who lived through that year of victory and tragedy, of mourning and hope, the future was uncertain. They knew only their own moment, the crowded streets, the returning soldiers, the president's funeral cortege moving slowly up Broadway. They lived their lives between memory and anticipation, in a city that was simultaneously the achievement and the challenge of American civilization.